Okay, so obviously, Meghan Murphy is a writer, journalist, and founder and editor of Canada's leading feminist website, Feminist Current. She has been podcasting and writing about feminism since 2010 and has published work in numerous national and international publications, including New Statesman, Quillette, Vice, Al Jazeera, Unheard, The Globe, and Mail, CBC News, and more. Meghan holds a master's degree in gender, sexuality, and women's studies from Simon Fraser University, and she also completed partially a journalism degree. Nice.
I'm a journalism
Solidarity with that. So just before we start the event, I just want to give a few points of how we like to keep our atmosphere here. One, when people come up, you know, when we have the Change My Mind after her initial lecture, we like to have people who disagree. I ask everyone in the audience not to antagonize anyone who comes up, just because it takes an enormous amount of bravery to disagree in front of a whole room of people. After that, we're going to be focusing more on a Q&A, just for those of you who are more or along the lines of asking questions or maybe, you know, wanting some clarification. That's fine too. The next thing I'd just like to say is that, you know, we're a club, the Students for Freedom of Expression. We really don't condone nor approve of any sort of speaker that we really host. It's just a matter of we're great hosts.
I am the founder of the UBC Men's Rights Association. For the record, I believe Meghan Murphy has not been informed that the UBC Men's Rights Association is co-sponsoring this event with the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression. But for the record, we are very pleased to be able to provide financial support to help make this event possible. On behalf of the UBC MRA, I would also like to recognize Dr. Ed Stevens and the Foundation for Male Studies in New York for their generous financial support of this event with Meghan Murphy tonight. I plan to speak for 5 to 10 minutes about the work of the UBC Men's Rights Association and about this event tonight. Despite having women's studies and related courses for nearly half a century, the University of British Columbia continues to not have one equivalent permanent course on male issues on either campus. And it is currently standard practice to earn gender studies type degrees at this university without ever taking a single course about males. Half of the population is being excluded from serious and equitable consideration in the current curriculum. The UBC Men's Rights Association advocates for the creation of a male studies course at UBC and is currently engaged in an anti-male discrimination claim against UBC about this issue. For more information on our activism, including the variety of ongoing anti-male discrimination claims facing UBC currently, there's a range of them, please visit ubcmra.com. Briefly, regarding this event, it seems to be perfectly well-timed. An article just published in, I think it's the Vancouver Star today, speaks of a recent ruling here in Vancouver. Quote, a Vancouver human rights tribunal has ruled there's no room for public debate about whether transgender people are who they say they are. The 104-page ruling, which goes into detail about the types of discrimination trans people face, is a win for trans rights in BC and across the country, said Susanna Alabado Quayle. This decision is, quote, this decision is really a landmark decision in establishing the scope of protections under the Human Rights Code for transgender people, she said. Quote, it is not a legitimate subject of public debate whether or not it's okay to be transgender or whether transgender people are real. Let me say, this ruling is precisely the kind of authoritarianism about which we have been warned, for example, by Dr. Jordan Peterson and others. This is an attempt to impose a particular politically acceptable narrative about trans identity on society and academia. For alternative views on the transgender question, I recommend the work of, for example, Ray Blanchard and J. Michael Bailey, including the paper co-authored by J. Michael Bailey entitled, quote, what many transgender activists don't want you to know and why you should know it anyway. Some trans activists would claim that the trans activist movement is just another liberation movement, like the gay liberation movement. While there may be some parallels, overall, I do not think it is so simple as that. To clarify the position, I occasionally use an analogy which is sure to amuse some and enrage others, especially trans activists. To be gay, to have a preference for having sex with a particular sex, is like having a preference for eating chocolate cake. But there is a great deal of difference between liking chocolate cake and asserting that you are, in fact, a chocolate cake. And making laws to punish those who would deny that you are, in the fullest sense of the word, a chocolate cake. That is an entirely different matter than liking cake or not. Whatever the amount of frosting you may apply, whether you have really baked a cake, in this case, is a matter of opinion and personal ideology, if anything. There is significant room for disagreement, and the government and human rights tribunals should not attempt to limit the freedoms of society to please transgender activists and their ideological allies. Transgender ideology is of interest to men's rights activists in part because the idea that sex is merely a social construct can provide yet another excuse for gender studies departments in universities to continue to neglect legitimate male social justice issues and focus instead just on gender as a performance or gender as socially constructed. It is reasonable to extend politeness to people who identify as the opposite sex, for instance, while still making room for people who hold the traditional view that a trans woman is not a woman, in the truest sense, and a trans man is not a man, in the truest sense. People born male and female cannot truly transition to the other sex, and to pretend so is merely a polite societal accommodation. As for non-binary folks, especially those who are not intersex, well, their identity is also absolutely publicly debatable, perhaps even more so than binary trans individuals. My understanding of the policies here at the University of British Columbia is that to say what I have just said is against current policy, possibly several policies, and as a current UBC student, that is why I have drafted this speech in this way to challenge the policies. I believe I have a moral duty, including as a philosophy student and men's rights activist, to point out that the Human Rights Tribunal is out of line, that this is ideological tyranny. Given this news about the government's tribunal, you may now consider this public discussion at UBC tonight an act of civil disobedience against a quietly spreading tyranny, which is consuming our public political life on a variety of different fronts. Related current radical social justice movement trends are having a corrupting influence on the ability of our universities to investigate a diverse range of viewpoints. And this corruption is spreading into the broader society via policymakers and other university graduates. Tonight's event is a little rebellion against these seemingly unstoppable social trends. May there be more such rebellions. On behalf of the UBC Men's Rights Association, I hope you all enjoy tonight's event with Meghan Murphy. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy your evening.
Thanks everyone for coming. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I didn't know that this event was sponsored by the UBC MRA Club. I've never done any event sponsored by MRAs before, so I guess we can think of it as a little bit amusing. I, of course, support people's rights to express whatever views they like, and I think that in general, people are well-intentioned in their views in politics, so I guess I want to assume the best about people, yeah, I think more than anything, this is just a little bit amusing. First, I want to thank you all for coming and participating in this conversation. I know that it's a controversial one, and so I appreciate you just showing up. I feel like people are vilified even for wanting to witness these kinds of conversations, never mind participate, never mind share views or ask questions that we're not supposed to ask. So, and of course I also want to thank and commend UBC students for freedom of expression for hosting this event. I know that the organizer got some death threats over it, and I don't even think he necessarily agrees with me. I think he sort of probably doesn't hold any concrete position about this issue and just wanted to host the conversation. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
So, and got a bunch of death threats as a result. So, so I first want to talk a little bit about bigotry, and namely what that word means. Intolerance towards those who hold different opinions from oneself. Last week I noticed that a group called UBC Students Against Bigotry had announced a counter-event in response to this talk. This has become a semi-common response, I've noticed, on the parts of trans activists when women speak about their concerns about gender identity, ideology, and legislation, and invite others into the discussion. So rather than attend and hear what those women have to say, rather than engage in the conversation in good faith, they refuse to attend and accuse us of bigotry, wildly misrepresent our arguments and concerns, and then instead hold some kind of counter-event, I guess, to protect themselves from the trauma of having to hear ideas they don't want to hear, lest they end up agreeing with those ideas or realizing that their ideas are bunk. So I suppose this is a better alternative than the usual response, which is death threats, but I think it's still kind of unproductive and revealing nonetheless in its own way. So tonight, these Students Against Bigotry held a march and teach-in to counteract this event and provide a platform for discussing the violence induced by TERF narratives, how to dismantle such narratives, and Meghan Murphy's actions. I can't be sure which actions they're referring to, seeing as I've not ever, of course, engaged in violence against trans-identified people, nor do I advocate anything close to that. So I don't know. I suspect that they're mad that I keep talking despite having been told to shut up a bunch of times. They also claim that I openly speak out against the existence and protection of trans women. I have never spoken out against the existence or protection of trans-identified males. I'm well aware that trans-identified people exist and are sometimes subjected to violence or harassment, something that, of course, I absolutely do not condone. I just don't agree with the beliefs of those who have taken up gender identity ideology and legislation as their pet cause. Namely, I don't believe that it's possible to be born in the wrong body or to change sex. I also don't believe that the earth is flat or that God created man. And had any of these people elected to come to this event, rather than labeling it hate speech and bigotry, they would know what it is I'm actually concerned about and fighting for, which is primarily the protection of women's rights and spaces. The irony of a group claiming to be against bigotry while simultaneously expressing intolerance towards those who hold different opinions than them seems too obvious to miss. But over and over again we see this pattern. Women try to talk about how gender identity ideology and legislation might impact women's rights, and trans activists threaten, harass, smear, and attempt to silence those women. Or they simply plug their ears and shout hate speech and transphobia over and over again, drowning out any possibility of rational discussion. When some women organized an event to discuss gender identity and women's rights at the Vancouver Public Library in January, we received a number of sexualized, misogynist, violent threats, and numerous people worked very hard to have that event shut down. They accused us of hate speech without even having heard what it is we have to say. The library was not legally permitted to cancel our booking, so they didn't, but they smeared us publicly and forced us to move the event to 9:30 p.m. on a weeknight due to concerns about protesters harassing staff and patrons, and tried but failed in the end, actually, to impose an extra $2,000 in security fees on us. In the end, the event went great. It sold out. Most people behaved in a respectful way, with the exception of a couple weird comments. But everyone left feeling galvanized, and anyone who wants to can watch the talk on YouTube and see for themselves. But this is an exception. Up until this year, this conversation about the impact of gender identity on women's rights had not been allowed to happen in Canada. The media pretty much has almost wholly ignored that there are feminist concerns about these issues, and cover it in like a totally biased, one-sided way. Even actually before that event happened at the VPL, the CBC had a panel discussion about the event that they didn't invite me to so that people could speculate about what I might think and say. The tactics, the smears, the accusations of bigotry, the threats, the attempts to shut down events have proven to be very successful, as now people are very much scared to talk and ask questions about this issue. But considering the harms of gender identity, ideology, and legislation, we do need to talk about it. This isn't the only issue in debate wherein students respond this way, by plugging their ears or attempting to shut down the conversation. This does seem to be part of a broader trend, wherein differing opinions or conversations deemed politically incorrect are treated as some kind of contagion, like thinking critically about our own accepted political positions, ideologies, and beliefs, or hearing the opinions of those we presume to disagree with will give us cooties. This kind of anti-intellectualism on campuses, of all places, is quite appalling in my opinion, and goes against everything universities should stand for. Instead, it's become the norm. Even professors go along with it. Again, the organizer of this event told me that he approached some of the professors in the gender studies department and they were extremely rude to him just about the idea and possibility of attending. I recently did an event in Calgary, and a couple of the professors, it was at Mount Royal University, and one professor who's in the Women's and Gender Studies department, named Kim Williams, said that feminists who argue that trans activism negatively impacts women's rights is incongruous to the foundational liberatory tenets of feminist praxis. University of Calgary professor named Rebecca Sullivan, who specializes in feminist media and cultural studies, claimed that even to ask the question of how gender identity ideology and legislation impacts women's rights is the antithesis of critical thinking and beneath the integrity of any university. I don't know how we got here. I mean, the primary purpose of universities is to think, to learn how to think, to ask critical questions, to learn how to form coherent, evidence-based arguments, and continuously shocked at the state of academia today. These are professors who not only should be encouraging students to engage in debates and critical thought, but who actually specialize in feminist and or gender studies, meaning one might assume they would hold knowledge about their own discipline, the history of the feminist movement, and the fight for women's rights. These kinds of statements are so dangerous and so ironic to me because the truth is, of course, that it's trans activists who refuse to engage in critical thinking. And it's those who push gender identity ideology who have gone after and attempted to silence feminists who offer a historical analysis of sex and gender under patriarchy. It is, in fact, beneath the integrity of any university to discourage or prevent engagement with critical questions and respectful debate, not the other way around. Before I get any deeper into my critiques of gender identity, ideology, and legislation, I want to go over some terms I frequently use. After having done this for a little while now, I've learned that one thing that comes up over and over again in this debate is that those who advocate gender identity, ideology, and legislation refuse to define their terms in clear and coherent ways, which makes genuine conversation and debate impossible. Without clear definitions, words mean nothing, and communication goes nowhere. I sometimes wonder if this is intentional, a means to prevent rational dialogue, and instead force us into the kind of nonsensical, postmodernist discourse gender studies students and professors alike have adopted as a means to bolster a false sense that they're somehow more intelligent than anyone outside their discipline, which I view as a really elitist technique, which is ironic considering how much they go on about concepts like privilege, systems of power, and marginalization. Either way, it ensures these conversations are not rooted in truth or material reality, or science for that matter, but are entirely subjective. So words mean whatever an individual feels they mean. Bodies don't really exist. The mind determines truth, so much so that a woman who becomes pregnant, something only females are capable of, can claim to really be a man, and that therefore men can become pregnant. All this because this is the reality one individual desires and prefers. It's an excellent way to breed insanity. I often feel like I'm losing my mind. So for coherency's sake, and hopefully to ensure our sanity tonight, some definitions. When I say sex, I'm referring to biology, whether an individual is male or female. I define a man as an adult male human, and a woman is an adult female human. This is how most of the world for most of history has understood the terms man and woman. When I say gender, what I mean is the stereotypes and social roles imposed on males and females based on their sex. This is what I mean when I talk about femininity and masculinity. So the ideas we hold in our society about what men and women should be, what social norms we're expected to adhere to, how we should dress, how we should act, what we should like, what kinds of jobs we should have, what our personality traits should consist of, etc. When I say trans activist, I'm not specifically or necessarily talking about trans-identified people. I'm talking about any person who promotes and supports gender identity, ideology, and legislation. When I say gender identity ideology or transgender ideology, I'm referring to the idea that it's possible for a person to be born in the wrong body, or that it's possible for a person to change sex. When I talk about gender identity legislation, I'm referring to legislation and policies that allow people to self-identify as any sex they like and to access facilities, spaces, political positions, shelters, jobs, grants, universities, sports competitions, etc. on that basis. I do not use the term cis, which is a word created by trans activists to refer to people whose gender identity matches their sex. This is because I do not have a gender identity, and in fact, no one does. We have bodies and we have personalities, and my personality is not a set of stereotypes. I refuse to identify myself with a set of stereotypes that have been used to defend sexist practices and beliefs throughout history. I am also not a biological essentialist, though I'm often accused of this. Biological essentialism is the idea that an individual's personality is an innate or natural essence, and that this is attached to their sex. So, a biological essentialist position could be, for example, the idea that a person is born with a gender identity that is hardwired and internal, and that if that gender identity fits the stereotypes offered up to us by the notion of, for example, femininity, that person must be female. I believe that females and males can have all kinds of personalities. I believe that boys and girls should be allowed to play with whichever toys they like and wear whatever clothes they like, regardless of whether or not those clothes and toys are designated for girls or for boys. I do not believe all females are inherently passive, irrational, emotional, and drawn to makeup and stilettos. I do not believe that all males are inherently unemotional, rational, and aggressive, and drawn to sports and trucks. I want people to be themselves and be free to live their lives in ways that feel fulfilling and authentic to them. I don't believe any person should be discriminated against or harassed because they step outside the gender stereotypes laid out for us and enforced on us in many ways. As a feminist, I think we should encourage people to step out of those stereotypes. This also means that I don't believe that because, for example, a boy likes pink and wants to play with dolls or wants to wear dresses, that this means he's not male, but in fact female. I think that is an incredibly regressive, sexist, and irrational point of view. I don't think boys are limited to the narrow confines of masculinity, and I don't think girls are limited to the narrow confines of femininity, as we understand those ideas today in society. This has always been what feminism has advocated. Nonetheless, today we're told the opposite. And people who seemingly have no understanding of feminist and women's history are telling us that actual feminists, actual women who are actually supporting female victims of male violence, challenging gender stereotypes, and fighting to ensure women maintain their sex-based rights are the real bigots. Not those going after, say, transition houses supporting and housing women who are subjected to rape and domestic abuse. A couple of weeks ago, Vancouver City Councillors voted to cut funding to Canada's longest-standing rape crisis centre and transition house. This happened after a number of local trans activists, namely BC NDP Vice President Morgan Auger, complained that the organization didn't allow men to train to become counselors at the transition house or house male victims of violence. This is, for the record, well within their rights. Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter won the right to determine their own membership and who they serve at both the provincial Supreme Court and at the federal level in 2007. All oppressed groups have this right. Morgan Auger has attempted to claim over and over again that what groups like Vancouver Rape Relief are doing is against the law in Canada. But not only is he wrong, specifically about rape relief, but if what you were saying were true, that would mean that services specifically for, say, immigrants or Indigenous mothers or even for trans-identified people were similarly guilty of discrimination. Beyond that, this particular grant is for public education, something Vancouver Rape Relief has offered for free to everyone, regardless of sex, race, class, ability, or gender identity for decades. The efforts to take away funding from an organization like Vancouver Rape Relief are an explicit attack on feminists who understand that being born female in this world means something. It isn't just an outfit you put on and take off. It means you are treated a particular way in this world and that you are particularly vulnerable in particular situations. This is why they believe, and I would assume anyone who has empathy towards female victims would understand this as well, that women need spaces to escape and heal from male violence that are free from men. Vancouver Rape Relief has been around since the 70s. They have run largely through the contributions of volunteers. They build these services from the ground up and serve thousands of women through their crisis line every year. They house 100 women and their children every year who have nowhere else to go. These women need Vancouver Rape Relief, and the mere fact that this is what trans activists are doing with their time and energy, going after the services that some of the most vulnerable among us need, should demonstrate the real aims and effects of this movement and ideology. This is about attacking women's services, spaces, and rights This is not about building up, but tearing down. So, one of the reasons I challenge gender identity ideology is because I think it's regressive, sexist, and nonsensical. I think it limits us rather than allowing us a full range of options as human beings with diverse interests and personality traits. I think it puts forth an incredibly rigid understanding of gender and treats biological, material reality as something intangible. But I also think it has incredibly negative impacts on women's rights in particular. And I think it's important that when enacting legislation and making sweeping changes to policies that impact women and girls, we should be having a conversation about it and engaging in rigorous public debate. Patriarchy came to be as a means to control women's reproductive abilities. In other words, it is based on our bodies. It's not based on our personalities or our choice in clothing. It's based on the fact that we're born female. Stereotypes around gender were imposed on us and used against us to limit our choices, power, and freedom. In the not-so-distant past, women were not allowed to vote or hold public office because of gender. Women's place was in the home, and they were said to be too delicate, emotional, and irrational to participate in politics and public life. We were kept out of universities. We were kept out of certain careers. The fact that we were capable of having babies meant that once we were in the workplace, we were discriminated against and not given promotions, for example. On December 6th, 1989, a young man walked into a classroom at École Polytechnique, an engineering school in Montreal, and separated the students into two groups, men and women. He then directed the men to leave the room and shouted, "I hate feminists," before firing at the women, killing 14 of them. He did this because he believed these women should not be taking up space in the traditionally male-dominated realm of engineering. In other words, he did this because those women were defying gender stereotypes. Gender, under patriarchy, is not our friend. It is restrictive, not liberatory. It's not something to be embraced. Today, women have specific rights based on the history and reality of sex-based oppression. We have specific sex-segregated spaces based on the understanding that men pose a threat to women. Not all men, but only men. Female firefighters had to fight in order to have access to their own locker rooms and facilities. This was because they were being subjected to sexual harassment and assault in the shared spaces. They only won this fight recently in Canada. And now we're being told that we must allow men into these spaces if they claim to feel feminine, whatever that means. Women had to fight in order for women's sport to be taken seriously. They had to fight for it to exist at all. They had to fight in order to have the right to compete on fair ground. Now, all that is being lost as sports bodies around the world are adopting policies that allow male athletes who identify as transgender to compete against and among women and girls. I ask trans activists over and over again, what does the word woman mean if not adult human female? On what basis do women's rights exist if the word woman is meaningless? If it has no definition, if anyone can identify in and out of femaleness on a whim. Beyond that, if woman is not a tangible thing, but anyone and everyone is potentially a woman, what does it mean to insist that trans women are women? What are we saying trans women are if we're saying they're women? I was suspended from Twitter for asking these questions, but I'm going to keep asking them. Whether or not we want to admit it, males and females are physically different. And this world has been built based on the idea of the male as the norm. So this means that cars have been designed for male bodies. Medical studies have been done primarily on men. Office temperatures are set based on what's comfortable for the male body, which is why we're cold all the time at work. Mystery solved. Studies done on how certain pharmaceutical drugs impact people have been conducted on men, not women. Women die from heart attacks more often than men because women's heart attack symptoms are completely different than men's, so we don't recognize when a woman's having a heart attack. Men have more muscle mass, longer limbs, bigger organs, and different bones than women. Their pelvises, spines, and feet are different. They move their bodies differently and have a different center of gravity. This all has a notable impact on athletic ability, among many other things. And none of this can be altered substantially through surgery or hormone treatments. Decreasing testosterone does not change the physical body of a male to such an extent that it becomes a female body. So when, for example, we're talking about things like health and women's sport, it is actually incredibly important to differentiate between male and female bodies. Women and girls are at risk of losing the ability to compete at all if they're forced to compete against male athletes, who will be stronger than them no matter how hard they train. Because I say these things and I ask these questions, I've been accused of lacking empathy. But I see no empathy for women in trans activism. I see no empathy for the girls who will lose scholarships and opportunities to boys who can easily beat them in track. I see no empathy for women and girls who don't feel comfortable with naked men in their change rooms at the pool. I see no empathy for the women who will have nowhere to turn if their local transition house is defunded on account of a woman-only policy. I see no empathy for Christy Hanna, a Toronto woman and survivor of sexual assault who had to leave her room at Palmerston House, a shelter for female recovering addicts, because she was made to share a room with a man and she didn't feel safe. I see no empathy for the 14 female estheticians who were asked to give a male a Brazilian bikini wax, then dragged to court when they declined, saying they only offer the service to women. Women and girls are being told they may not have boundaries, that they may not say no to men. This goes against so much of what feminism stands for and has accomplished over decades. What women have fought for over the past century is under attack, and we are calling it progress. It's not progress, it's the backlash. Thanks.
Reconciliation. My name is Leigh. I go by the pronouns they, them, and I am non-binary, as you say that is apparently not true. I just have a question around your definition of gender. You say that gender is stereotypes, for example, femininity and masculinity being the stereotypes that people are born with. Is that correct or incorrect?
No, so I don't think that people are born with those stereotypes. I think that those stereotypes are attached to people based on the sex they're born with. So like when a baby boy is born, he's assumed people assume that he's going to end up with certain personality traits. They're going to assume that he's more likely to want to play with trucks. When a baby girl is born, they're going to assume that she's going to be, more polite, more passive, like dresses, want to play with dolls, those kinds of things. And I don't think that those things are necessarily true. Of course, lots of girls do like playing with dolls, but boys also might like playing with dolls, etc., etc. So I don't think that the gender stereotype is necessarily innate. I think that it's a social concept.
So your talk of the social concepts is, like you just said, so the stereotypes that society gives that are not necessarily correct, but that are placed on a person at birth at times with little to no accuracy. Could you not say that you are stereotyping others by, for example, saying that non-binary people is extremely debatable? Because as a non-binary person, the binary is male or female. And from what you say, they come with stereotypes. And I guess what you call the gender ideology is that, for me personally, I'm in the middle, where yes, I may be biologically something, but that my gender identity, the way that I perceive myself, the way that I present myself, is different and not the same as the binary, but also that I do not associate myself with the stereotype that has been placed on a man or a woman, that I don't feel connected to either of those. So therefore, that is your ideology, is that others should be able to represent themselves in whichever way they wish, which is what I'm doing, but from at the stand sitting, it seems that you are doing the exact opposite, telling me to fit into one of these categories, and that if I don't do that, that I am invalid.
So the biology is a binary, so there is male or female. The gender, I don't think that the binary is real. So I would argue that everyone's non-binary, right? So no one fits perfectly into those stereotypes. Like women are not all of the stereotypes attached to femininity, men aren't all the stereotypes attached to masculinity. So I guess I feel like that term, non-binary, is just kind of redundant. Like, I don't like, by defining yourself as non-binary, I think that it assumes that that everybody else who isn't identifying themselves in that way is binary as far as gender goes. So,
well, not necessarily binary, but that they associate themselves with one of the two sides that you proved about, basically.
but I don't associate myself with femininity.
Not necessarily femininity, but with what comes with being a woman.
I think that being a woman is about being female, and that's it. I don't think that it's attached to the rest of those stereotypes. I think that we all have different personalities, and that some of those personality traits might be construed as masculine or feminine, but really they're just personality traits, like we're all sexual individuals.
And to you, being female is...
Having a female body.
So, by saying that, isn't that biological essentialism? I'm sorry, I just wrote this down.
No, so biological essentialism is when you're assuming that a person with a female body is inherently feminine on the inside and that the femininity is unchangeable.
I see. I just want to switch the kind of topic more towards the bathroom issues that were brought up towards trans people, mostly trans women not being accepted into bathrooms. So if you could speak more about what your thoughts on trans-inclusive bathrooms are, just so I have more context. I don't want to assume anything.
Well, I didn't say anything about trans-inclusive bathrooms, but and I didn't actually say anything about bathrooms in my talk, but...
The change rooms and the having them in segregated.
Right, so in a change room, in a women's change room, I don't think that men should be allowed in. So if you have a penis, you can't come into the women's change room.
What do you feel about washrooms, trans-inclusive washrooms?
Well, what do you mean by trans-inclusive? Like, trans people are welcome in the change rooms and washrooms, but, if you're female and you identify as trans, then, of course, you can use the women's washroom and the women's change room. If you're male and you identify as trans, then no.
I'm a little bit confused towards, can you explain what a trans female and a trans male are to me?
Like if you have a male body or a female body.
So
I'm talking about biology.
So would you call a trans woman, meaning that they have a male, and
that's why they're the trans
women, exactly.
Yeah.
So you think that trans women should be allowed in our bathrooms?
Trans women?
Yes.
No, because they're male.
But before you said that trans women should be allowed in trans males should not.
Is this confusing?
This is a...
Okay, because I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over and over again.
Well, that is what a conversation is, and that's how we are able to work.
I know, but it's not really going anywhere because I think that I
Does anyone else
clarified
want to
that.
speak?
I just want to say one thing. There's a mix-up between trans female and trans woman.
Yes.
That's where.
Oh, okay, that was okay.
Yes.
Sorry. So when I say, okay, I'm going to try to clarify again.
Here you go.
When I say trans woman, that's a person who's male but identifies as transgender or a trans woman. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
So,
Okay.
a thing I wanted to mention is that though you're saying like you do not think that they should be allowed in vacuums, that
Well, I think that there should be, I also think that there should be gender neutral washrooms and spaces so that people who don't want to use either of those washrooms or change rooms don't have to. But I definitely think that women and girls should be allowed access to change rooms that men aren't allowed in.
Sure, yeah, here, let me take yours. Thank you so much for coming up.
One of the things that frustrates me about when people talk about trans ideology, as well as just any sort of like even feminist discussions, is that they often leave out the and you probably heard this brought up a million times. I'm sorry, I haven't seen any of your talks before. They just completely ignore the presence of intersex people, and the fact that, you know, like there are like biologically male and biologically female people, and that's awesome. But, you know, nature and science and biology is really complicated, and I don't understand where the idea of, you know, say, someone with androgen insensitivity syndrome, or someone who has the chromosomes maybe just the X, or maybe XXY, someone, because those people do exist, where that falls into you know, your idea of gender and sex and identity.
I mean, yeah, like people who have intersex conditions exist, but that doesn't really have anything to do with transgenderism. So gender identity is the idea that, like, you might have a male body, but you don't identify with the stereotypes attached to masculinity, or you have a desire to be a woman, you would prefer to be a woman, but that person isn't intersex. They don't have an intersex condition, they still have a male body. So, yeah, that's real, but it's a separate issue from the trans issue.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, cool.
I just wanted to clarify.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming up.
I think maybe we should just draw a line between like the Q&A and the change my mind thing. So, because I suspect that a lot more people in the audience probably just want to engage in like a Q&A or make comments or something.
Sure,
rather than
that
having an argument with them.
sounds good. I'll run up and throw you the mic. If you guys have a question, just raise your hand.
I hope that's okay.
I recently heard about your interview with the coach for the Alberta Olympic team, or the Canadian Olympic team. Could you expand on the changes to the rules of the International Olympic Committee with regards to competition?
Yeah, she's the president of Alberta Athletics, I think, and she is also a coach. But, I mean, as far as I can tell, all the new policies that are being adopted by sports bodies, all that they say is you just have to have, for males anyway, who want to compete against women or with women, you have to have lower testosterone for a year. And that's it. And not even like low as like the levels aren't the same as women are tested for. They're still above those levels. And yeah, I mean, that lowering your testosterone for a year doesn't change your body so much so that it puts you on equal footing with women at all. So yeah, that's the policy that's being adopted.
Abuse of doctors that might be pushing this on children, on the mentally ill, to either make a lifelong pharmaceutical patient or someone to like basically mutilate their bodies.
I don't know that all doctors who are buying into the concept of trans kids, let's say, are necessarily abusive or necessarily have negative intentions. I think that it's fully possible that the pharmaceutical industry industry would have a vested interest in getting people on drugs for the rest of their lives. I mean, Big Pharma, that's kind of what they do. But I do think that like it's super sketchy and super dangerous to start putting kids on hormones or to prevent them from going through puberty. I mean, that ruins and changes your body for your entire life. And I definitely don't think that kids are in a position to make those kinds of decisions. And I mean, you have to wonder where like a kid would ever get the idea of transgenderism or gender identity. Where are these concepts coming from, and what does that even mean? Like, if a little kid says they feel like if a little boy says he feels like a girl, what does that mean to him? You know, it's probably likely that he knows about these stereotypes. So maybe he is interested in wearing dresses, or he's interested in playing with dolls, or he likes playing with girls more than he likes playing with boys. And in his mind, he's like, well, I guess that means I'm actually a girl, which again, I think is so sexist. Like, I feel like we kind of did all this, like we went over all this in the 70s, and we're like, no, it's okay for kids to play with different toys. And now we're sort of regressing back to like the 50s, where it's super rigid and restrictive, and you must somehow be wrong. And like, it's so weird to tell a kid that they're in the wrong body. I mean, nobody's in a wrong body. Like, you're just born in a body, and that's your body, and sometimes your body sucks, but like, you know, I don't think that we all like are in love with our bodies. Like, this is exactly what I would have asked for. But like, you know, too bad, it's your body. Like, like, what is that? To be born in a body is in the wrong body is such a weird concept. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Is your body ready?
My body is always ready. Okay, so I'm a little bit curious about how you might delineate. Growing up, let's put it this way. Growing up, I was very much pro-feminist because I thought it meant liberating people. It meant making it so that people have more options that are unnecessarily being restricted. But more and more it started feeling like feminism has become about invading male spaces and invading the way men do things, and not having sort of an appreciation for the fact that we're different and that we operate differently. So to put, some people are not maybe understanding what I'm saying, so let me put it in context. I'm a member of a fraternity, and fraternities and sororities operate very differently. Right? When you put a bunch of men together in the room, they're going to interact with each other in a way that's very different from the way women interact with each other. So even though I do think it's somewhat true to say that men and women are only different in the sense that their bodies are different, like you think, would that be correct?
I mean, I think that we're socialized in very different ways. And to be honest, like, I mean, I'm sure that there are aspects of gender and some of these gender roles and stereotypes that are connected to evolution. Like, I don't think that it's totally black and white, but I think that we definitely can't ignore how socialization functions in terms of reinforcing these gender roles.
So, like, just to give specific examples of what I mean of, you know, space sort of being taken, you know, you can't pick up a snowball in elementary schools. Boys can't wrestle with each other without getting into trouble. There's all sorts of ways men interact with each other, rough and tumble play, etc., that is sort of really being restricted. And it just feels like it comes from a place of not understanding that we're different. And so I do think that there are meaningful differences between men and women. Mm-hmm. And that oftentimes, for example, as awesome as feminism was, what happens with these movements is they gain momentum and they become unilateral philosophies. So they become like a feminist will always take the side that benefits women. Or a trans activist will always take the side that benefits trans people. A men's rights activist will always take the side that benefits men. And it stops being less like a negotiation and a thoughtful process of determining what is the arrangement that accommodates everyone, and more of just like a tribal thing. So I was wondering, what do you think is the right way in determining whether how do you determine whether you're stepping on someone else's boundaries or whether it is a proper step towards liberating the other group? how is that delineation made? Because it's actually very difficult. It's very difficult to know when you're making a policy whether you are giving women what they have always deserved or giving men what they have always deserved, or if you're stepping on somebody else's toe without understanding what you're doing.
I guess I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about in terms of men's spaces. Like, in the past, women wanted access to men's spaces because those were spaces that had power attached to them. So, like I said, like politics, universities, men's clubs, business, employment, things like that. So, I'm not sure exactly what spaces you're talking about now.
Okay. So, for example, it's really cool and very great in all sorts of ways, including economic, moral, and philosophical, that women are entering the workplace. But as that process happens, adjustments need to be made to how the workplace works, right? Mm-hmm. And so you could either have a sort of a philosophy where it's like, okay, well, every time women request an accommodation in sort of what the social norms in a workplace are, it should be granted. Or you could have a philosophy where you say, well, let's understand why things are the way they are, why the accommodation is being asked for, seeing what sort of compromises can be made that actually accounts for how men interact with each other. For example, men are much more likely to make lewd jokes towards each other. And I do think women are much more likely to be offended by it. And I do think that
because the jokes are being made at their expense. So, I mean, I think it's okay for there to be policies that accommodate women in the workplace. Of course they should. I mean, these are spaces that have been traditionally male-dominated, so I think that men are used to operating in a certain way, and maybe they do have to make some changes in order for women to feel comfortable on those spaces.
The core of the question is, how do you distinguish, how do you determine in any given scenario whether toes are being stepped on or the appropriate action is being taken? What is the criteria?
I don't think there is any specific criteria. I think that we have to be talking about specific situations and specific policies to be able to determine that. I mean, to be honest, I do think that there should be more of a conversation happening. I don't think that anybody should just be making blanket statements and refusing to engage with detractors per se. But yeah, as far as policy goes, I think that it's hard for me to answer that because it's like a general question and I don't know the specifics of what we're talking about.
Also, for specifics, examples that really kind of ring true to me is, it really seems like rough and tumble play is being restricted, and I feel like that was a huge deficit in my upbringing. There's also things like participation trophies, things like people can't joke. Like, I really do feel like men are the more flexible when it comes to humor in social circumstances. And it really does feel
I'm very flexible when it comes to humor in social circumstances. I love jokes.
Yeah, but like, again, when I'm talking overall trends. I know a lot of funny ones, but when a space, like, spaces do become less forgiving of, comedic adventure. No, that's not, incel is not funny, it's fucked up. I'm talking about...
Alright. Well, we'll wrestle after this.
People being sensitive is different than feminism. That kind of play isn't being taken away because of women. It's being taken away because of bullying and because of people getting killed and hurt. That has nothing to do with women or females or girls. I think you're really confused there.
I'm asking a question, so...
I understand, and I'm asking you the confusion.
And I'm saying, so it seems like it becomes just a bunch of tribes pulling things in certain ways, rather than there being a negotiation and a criteria and sort of an understanding of, well, like, for example, when we make this accommodation, how is this affecting...
So there's two different topics there. You're talking about tribes, people having different opinions and people wanting to fight for their rights or whatever. And then you're also talking about boys getting their play taken away. Those are two completely different things. And then you're coming at Meghan Murphy saying, well, what do you, basically blaming her for this. Well, what do you
take away rough and tumble play? Never even tried.
I'm curious, what are you asking Meghan Murphy?
I think it's a little ridiculous to say that I'm blaming you for anything. I said, well, how do you think, as someone who is experienced in feminism, right, is Like, how would a distinction like that be made?
I guess
What would actually be at stake in a thoughtful process of how do you decide? Like,
it's just never been what my feminism has focused on, so it's hard for me to answer these questions because most of my feminism and the work of the women that I'm allied with has been focused on male violence against women and things like sexual exploitation more so than the kind of stuff that you're talking about.
Example, for example,
Hey, just
I think we might need to move on.
just an open question. Is there any anti-wrestling feminists in here?
So we're still waiting for a response from Twitter, which we haven't received yet. They keep asking for extensions. But the basis of the case is in breach of contract and false advertising. So Twitter advertised itself as a platform for free speech over and over and over again. The CEOs insisted that they would not ban anyone for political reasons or ideological reasons. That's obviously not the case at all. They also committed to giving users 30 days notice if they're going to change the terms of service, which they didn't do around this new rule around misgendering and dead naming, which are concepts that I don't agree with in the first place, so those concepts themselves are debatable. And they promised that they wouldn't apply rules retroactively, which is what they did to me. Like, I was suspended for Twitter in the end for referring to this person who brought these estheticians to court as he. I wasn't aware that there was any rule against misgendering. This is a person who goes by a male name publicly on social media in any case. And they announced this new misgendering / dead naming rule the night that they suspended me. So like and they didn't even announce it, it was just turned up in the media, 15 minutes or something after they sent me an email on a Friday night saying that I was permanently suspended from Twitter. So that's what's going on. I don't know how they're going to respond or what they're going to say. I'm sure they're going to try to defend themselves and have the case dismissed. But
Do you hope to get back on the platform soon?
yes. Everyone hates Twitter, but I love Twitter. So I was kind of sad.
It has a lot of control over public discourse.
Yeah, it has a ton of control over public discourse. It not only, and they're not just doing this to me. This is happening to all sorts of people. So our case this is a public interest case. So nobody's making any money off of it, right? I'm not going to get any money. The lawyers aren't going to get any money. We're fundraising. So we're also asking that accounts be reinstated that were banned under these same circumstances. This has, Twitter shapes politics. Twitter shapes elections.
The president announced his plans there.
Right. And, for somebody like me, who's a writer and a journalist, and I'm independent, I don't work for a company, I don't work for anyone else, this has a huge impact on my ability to make a living, to make an income, to, connect with other writers, to connect with sources, to connect with other editors, for me to pitch, for me to be able to publish in other places. It's extremely punitive in defense of a predatory man. That's what happened. This is a predatory man. I called him he, I was banned. It's so crazy. It's so scary and dangerous.
For months now.
Yeah, sorry. I'm probably just telling you good things you already know, but
no, don't worry about it.
Really annoying.
There's lots of people in there that might not.
Twitter's working on it.
Hi, Megan. I wanted to ask you about the roots of transgenderism. Seems to be a recent phenomenon, recent years, but just do you recognize the same people who promoted that, the same people back in the 1960s that really got feminism going? It seems the motive for feminism in the 1960s and 70s was from an elitist perspective. They want to lower the birth rate. In 1960s, women would have 4 kids. By 1970s, have 3 or 2. So part of the agenda
that was
behind
really
was
the
to reduce
motivation
birth
for
rate.
feminism. I think that probably second wave feminists would argue that they were motivated by things like sexual harassment and domestic abuse and marital rape and not having equal opportunities in the workplace. Eventually things like pornography.
But it was socially engineered from the top.
I don't think it was.
Well, the evidence in Professor Kevin McDonald's book, The Culture of Critique, he goes into this whole process described how the Rothschild Zionists told me this had a very deep hatred for white European Christian society. So it was a gender-based attack of white race.
I mean, like, I know a lot of women who've been around in the feminist movement for a really long time, and I don't think they had any connection to any of these things.
Shut it down.
But because they go to such, insane, sacrifices, and they do all these sort of crazy things to transition, does that ever make you question if maybe there is some sort of huge drive in them that may suggest that what they're saying might be valid?
Well, most trans-identified people don't actually get those surgeries. My main issue and the main reason, there's other issues and reasons also, but the main issue and main reason that feminists really started fighting back about this issue was because of the self-identification thing. So there started to be policies and legislation that said literally anyone, like if you can just announce that you're the opposite sex, and in lots of places you don't even need a doctor's note. In some places you do still need like a doctor's note or a note from a nurse practitioner or a psychiatrist or something like that. But a lot of the new policies and legislation, it's just purely based on, announcing I'm a man or I'm a woman, and therefore I should be allowed into these spaces. I should be allowed to transfer into a female prison, they're male, obviously be allowed access to change rooms, access to transition houses, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, as far as the hormones and if people want to get those surgeries, and that's genuinely going to make them feel better, then that's okay. They can do that. I'm not trying to stop anyone from doing that. I do think that they're very serious surgeries that should be considered very carefully. It's no small thing. But I don't understand why, in order to, I think that trans activism would claim to be about wanting people to be accepted as they are and to be able to express themselves as they are. And I support those ideas. So I don't understand why, in order to accept people as they are and to support people in expressing themselves as they want to express themselves and to live the lives that they want to live, we have to insist that they're literally the opposite sex. That just seems unnecessary to me. I think that what we should be advocating is to accept people as they are and accept people who step out of these gender roles and stereotypes.
I thank you, Meghan Murphy, for having the courage to speak up against the status quo. And I truly admire that. I also want to mention, or ask a question, because, like for instance, in a situation where trans-identified females, or or trans women, whatever role trans people use, in a situation where they're prioritized over biological females or biological women, wouldn't that be considered trans feminism instead of feminism? Would it be like feminism versus trans feminism?
No, it's misogyny.
I think that just I get it. So trans feminism, you're saying trans feminism would be where trans identified people or trans women were prioritized over females?
Yes, that's my question.
I don't think that's feminism, because feminism is about women.
Right.
Liberating women, specifically, from patriarchy and male violence against women.
I think what she means to say is she's talking about intersectional sort of.
Well, intersectionality is about understanding that, women who are, say, women of color or women who are poor or working class, they have different experiences because they're working class or because they're black or what have you. And that they experience different forms of oppression on that basis, not just oppression based on their sex. So I don't really think that intersectionality has anything to do with gender identity per se.
Hi. Earlier you mentioned that there are the differences between male and female, and we can't change those differences. And sure, medical science can't necessarily change things yet, but what happens when it gets to that point? Or would you hold that it can't get to that point?
I mean, I don't think that a man is ever going to ovulate. No matter how far science goes with this, I don't see how that would be possible.
What about transgender women who don't ovulate?
Well, just because a woman doesn't ovulate, it doesn't make her not female. So females are the member of the species that is capable of producing ova and of reproducing. Well, it doesn't make her not female. I mean, humans have 2 legs, but if you only had 1 leg, you would still be a human, and we would still say humans are bipedal.
I think an insult to menopausal women or postmenopausal women. I stopped ovulating years ago. Am I still not a woman?
No, you're definitely
Right.
So, I just don't understand how the connection that some women don't ovulate means that some men do.
Right.
On the same line, certainly men have accidents as far as their genitalia is concerned. Certainly in wars and any other kind of violent fighting, things can happen. So say a man loses his reproductive capabilities, does that make him now a woman suddenly? No.
Right. No. Not quite that easy.
Just have to say, if we ever come to the opportunity where we choose between men and women, you'd be stupid to choose either. I'm going to be reptilian.
If I can clarify my point about Turner syndrome, I just don't think it's fair to make the point that a person could never identify as a woman because they don't ovulate, and
Well, I
then
didn't
state
say that.
ovulation isn't that the point you made?
No.
That, like,
No, I said it's
Only
established
women
that
ovulate.
females
Men
who
can't.
don't ovulate,
It's not required.
but that men cannot ovulate.
That's fair, but then I'm confused why the first point to like why a person could never transition is that they can't ovulate, you know?
Well, what do you mean by transition? Are you talking about a man who's announcing that he's a woman? What, are you talking about surgeries? Are you talking about hormones? There's like a pretty wide spectrum that's included under this transgender umbrella that no one will be specific about. Like, who are we even talking about when we're talking about transgender? Like, what is a transgender person? How are we defining that?
That's a very valid confusion because the space within transition is really wide. May I bring my definition of transition?
Sure.
So in my view, a person who transitions is a person who decides that a gender expression they prefer and a gender identity they prefer would make them happier, healthier, live better lives. And then they take steps to make that a reality. They take steps to, quote unquote, look the part. They take steps to change which pronouns they go by. Sometimes people change the names as a way to like make it easier to shift pronouns. And so then, like if a person is taking clear, actionable steps so that they are socially perceived as women or as men, I don't see how that makes it so it's so confusing to treat them socially however they prefer to identify.
I mean, if they end up being treated socially as women, then that's unfortunate. But I'm joking. But my argument is just that it doesn't literally make them female, and that there's no reason to insist that it does. I mean, being socially perceived as a woman, i.e. adopting these stereotypes attached to women, these feminine stereotypes, doesn't literally change their sex. So, I mean, if people want to identify as transgender, I guess that's fine. I'm not going to argue with how somebody wants to identify, but when we start creating legislation and policies around that identity that say, for example, you're literally the opposite sex and that you should be allowed access to these spaces, rights, grants, whatever, on that basis, that's when we start to get into trouble. I mean, yeah, like express yourself however you want.
That's fair. Can I bring another question since we're in this conversation again? When you said about gender identity, that everyone is kind of non-binary, quote unquote, and I'm not trying to like hold you down to definitions or anything like that, just that you brought up that people have different ways of feeling and, you know, living and expressing themselves. In that sense, then, from what I understand, you said that men behave, quote unquote, in masculine ways because that's what society expects them to do, and vice versa for women, then if a guy feels manly when he's like, say, playing rough with his bros on the mud, I don't know, there's just an example that came up, then is that just him being manipulated by a social construct? Like,
No,
are
not
people allowed to
necessarily.
feel joy in their gender, you know?
I mean, I don't know that, like, I just don't know that we have to attach that kind of behavior specifically and only to boys and specifically only to masculinity. I mean, there's lots of things that girls like to do that would be called masculine and vice versa. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it would be better for us as a society to accept that people are different and allow girls and boys to operate outside these gender roles if that's what they want, instead of imposing these gender roles on them and insisting that they kind of stick within those confines.
I think the argument is that, like, the guy who likes to roughhouse and, you know, express himself in that way may also enjoy crying during rom-coms or whatever, right? So I think most of us, or at least I'll speak only for myself, I don't only adhere to what people would claim to be feminine. I don't shave my legs, you know, there's a million things. But I don't think that defines my gender identity, that's just my personality. And I think that that's what the argument is that these labels are actually restrictive in some ways rather than liberating.
I think the point is it restrictive for who? Because I identify as non-binary. I'm like pretty masculine. Sometimes I put on some lipstick. It makes me feel well, it makes me feel happy. When I look at myself and I think, who am I? The answer is, oh. And I feel like no matter what your behavior, if the concept of womanhood feels right to you, and being with women and being seen as a woman feels right to you, that's great, no matter what type of woman you are. And I'm all for, and I really appreciate the work you have been doing in helping women who suffer abuse. I really appreciate that work. It's incredibly important. And I really appreciate the work of opening space so that people can express themselves in more ways, so that womanness is less restrictive or masculinity is less restrictive. But I think ultimately, when we're talking about gender identity, and this is why we bring up this concept, there is some association with being a man psychologically and feeling good with masculine behavior, whatever it is socially defined. And there is a feeling good, of feeling like a woman when you are a woman and you're doing things that are associated with.
But like sometimes I feel good when I'm expressing myself in a masculine way, like being assertive or being really rational.
Yeah.
Or fighting with people.
And it is awful that those things are associated only with masculinity. I completely agree. But then when you're doing those things, you still feel the identity of being a woman doing those things, right?
No, I mean, I'm not really feeling anything. I'm just like, I'm not really thinking about it as an identity. I'm just feeling myself. I'm just going to be authentic, I guess.
I'd just like to ask a question, just playing devil's advocate. You know, organizing this event has been really interesting, and I'm getting lots of perspectives, especially from trans activists who believe that you're committing some sort of erasure of trans identity. I just wanted to get your opinion, again, devil's advocate. Are you in some way committing violence against transgender people by essentially denying their identity based on the fact that suicide statistics among trans people are so high, and mostly it is attributed to the fact that they are either bullied in some way by their peers or by society who don't accept their form of identity? I just want to figure out what your response would be. I'm sure you've heard this question before.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't argue that feminists are responsible for people who are feeling depressed or suicidal. I think that's sort of like a dangerous leap to make. My arguments are against the concept of gender identity, again, and the legislation that's attached to that concept. I don't know that trans-identified people are necessarily more suicidal than men. For example, men have really high rates of suicide also, and so do gay and lesbian people, kids, teenagers. And I mean, to say that like, because people are expressing opinions that we don't like, or trying to, you know, challenge legislation that they think is really dangerous, or challenge ideas that they think is dangerous, like hopefully I've explained that I actually do think this is a really serious issue, and that I do think that it's really harmful for women and girls. Like this isn't just like a fun intellectual exercise for me. And so to try to like stop people from having conversations, or stop people from asking really important questions about laws and policies and ideas that are taking hold in our society because they might kill themselves is not cool. Like it's not okay to do that. It's not okay to try to censor free speech because like you're gonna kill yourself. I mean, that's putting a lot of responsibility on other people and trying to stop people from having opinions that you don't like under this weird threat that actually, you know, abusive men have used a lot historically to say, like, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. Like, that's a really manipulative thing to do, so I'm not really into that line of thought.
Nice.
I found those statistics. Sorry, so just because you said about the past, I just wanted to list off, in the American Suicide Prevention Association, they say that 47% of trans women have attempted suicide, 28% of trans men, and then, wait, sorry. I found the wrong statistic, I'm sorry.
I mean, it's...
Okay.
Really good.
All right. Nice. Any other questions? Oh, hey, yeah.
You brought up the example earlier that since most humans have 2 legs, then we can say on a general note that humans have 2 legs, right?
Right.
So in that way, if most men behave a certain way and most women behave a certain way, why is it sexist or evil to say that men are this way and women are that way?
I don't think that it's sexist or evil to say, in general, men behave this way and women behave this way. I think that it's sexist to say that you can only behave that way and that you should behave in that way. And I think that we have to consider the really expansive role that socialization plays in terms of determining our behaviors and roles and what we end up liking and what we end up wearing as kids and as adults. Like, these things happen in really subtle ways. But yeah, like I do think that this is a really complicated conversation to get in, but like, again, I'm not going to argue that nothing in terms of gender role has to do with evolution. I assume this is sort of what you're getting at. But I do argue that a lot of it has to do with socialization and that we should be flexible in terms of, like, you know, the direction that we push boys and girls in when they're kids. But also, I mean, not preventing women from doing certain things, and not preventing women from accessing certain, you know, jobs or disciplines or whatever because they're women and they shouldn't be doing that, and you're a woman so you should be behaving in this way, you should look this way, you should be in a dress and you should look pretty, blah, blah, blah. Like, I do think that those ideas are destructive and sexist. And same thing for men, like you shouldn't express your emotions, like you shouldn't cry, like you shouldn't be vulnerable. Those are all negative and sexist stereotypes that I think that we should be challenging.
Hi. I just wanted to ask something you mentioned earlier. You talked about dead naming, and I don't remember you said that you didn't believe in it or didn't agree with it, but can you clarify your position on it?
I don't agree with the concept because I don't think that it's necessary or even good to pretend that, say, for example, a man, he had his male name for his whole life, maybe he committed a violent crime and went to jail and then leaves jail and decides he wants to transition and now he's going to be known by this female name and he's allowed to erase that entire history from the internet, and no one's allowed to refer to him by that name. No one's allowed to say, like, you used to be so-and-so, and now you're this. Like, it's not, like, what is this? Like, you pretend that you're dead because you transition, like, you change your name so that person no longer exists anymore? Like, it's just sort of a weird concept, and I think that it, sorry, I'm forgetting to talk into the mic because I'm moving around too much. Yeah, it doesn't seem necessary, and it seems dangerous in a lot of situations. It seems like it has the potential, and I've seen this happening already, to ensure that men aren't held accountable for past behavior. And it's being used, I mean, it's like...
It's erasing the past.
Yeah, it's erasing the past, and you know, with the Twitter situation, it's being used in this really weird way where we're not allowed to mention this man's name, who is, again, behaving in a kind of predatory way. And so he now has a lot of control over what the public knows about him and says about him, and people are being punished for talking about him. And he still goes by his male name too, so I don't know how that qualifies as dead naming. But so there are some problems with that concept.
Okay. Can I just ask a quick follow-up question in general? I understand that that's a very specific issue, but generally speaking, just can you explain what dead naming is? Because I don't want to misunderstand your concepts, because you've mentioned a few concepts at the beginning of this, and they're different than what I have been socialized to understand. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So for you, dead naming is...
I mean, dead naming isn't a term that I use. So I'm just going off of what I can, you know, what I see in social media and trans activism. What these people seem to believe dead naming is, which it appears to be about using somebody's name pre-transition.
Okay, and how, I'm just trying to understand, so that's not dangerous then, by not referring to them by their preferred pronoun, that's not also dangerous?
How would it be dangerous?
So,
like, if you refer to a woman by, like, her maiden name, I don't think that endangers her, but that's her old name. She changed her name, she got married.
Again, devil's advocate. This is the reason why I hear dead naming is so provocative and damaging, is that as a part of the therapy of transitioning, it is implied that society ought to...
I'm going to talk to you about that.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, though. I appreciate it. What I mean is that the double entendre, not even like the whole emotional thing, which I'm not going to sit here and not validate, but I used to live in South America, and there are people who are misgendered get killed. So not only is dead naming about killing your former self in whatever metaphorical name, but it's about preserving your actual life. So I'm just trying to understand how you can sit here and talk about how this is dangerous for women because you're erasing your past, because you can't be Googled anymore, but your criminal record is still very, very valid. While at the same time, dead naming is also actively putting people in positions of danger. Like earlier when you asked if there are transgender people in the room surrounded by people who are transphobic. I just don't understand how you're creating these spaces that are actively dangerous
I'm
to
not
certain
sure I
people.
understand how, like, acknowledging that somebody used to have a different name endangers them.
Because, let's say for example, I'm transgender, and I'm sitting in the space with people who don't think that that is a valid identity, and I come out and I say that I'm transgender. Does that not put me in danger? I'm just trying to understand, like, are we not going to talk about the hate crimes that occur against transgender people? Like, I'm just trying to understand, like, how we separate the violence that occurs against transgender bodies from the mislabeling of transgender people.
The hate crimes that occur against transgender people, so trans women who are killed by men.
Okay.
That's male violence.
But that's not male transphobia. That's not.
They found out a person's real name. Like, I mean, and most of those men are Johns.
If you are a gay man and he gets murdered, did you participate in that hate crime?
Me?
No, I'm not saying, hypothetically, if you outed a gay man in a homophobic space and he was murdered.
Well, how would I know if that person wasn't identifying themselves as transgender, then how would I know that they were transgender, considering that it's only about self-declaration? So how would I be outing them? They've already outed themselves by identifying as transgender, a trans woman.
Right, I feel that. I'm not talking about trans. I'm talking, the point they brought up was around hate crimes and allowing a hate crime to happen by outing someone, right?
Yeah, but
when you dead name someone, you're outing them In that case, the person was already out. And I totally feel how that doesn't apply there. But the point was that naming someone invalidates their experience and may out them to a space that may lead to danger.
I think this is getting into a weird territory, but I don't know that transgender people are being killed because somebody else is outing them as transgender. As I said, they're getting killed by men, and so I think that's not because, like a feminist acknowledged their real name.
So a woman can still
I mean,
out a
so
man.
like I said, I was accused of dead naming this person who still goes by their male name on social media. There's still posts by him on social media under his male name, but now he refers to himself as a female name also, so I'm not allowed to acknowledge that he did all this stuff under his male name, which was again, predatorial to women and girls.
I see how that's a complicated example.
I mean, I'm not doxing anyone here. I'm not interested in going around and finding out people's past names and posting their information on the internet anyway. I'm not advocating that. But I think that this concept that somehow you die and your entire past disappears and no one can ever mention it again because you decided you wanted to identify as transgender is weird and pointless. And I don't really think it endangers anyone in Canada, to be honest.
So I think it's probably getting rather late at this point. I want to keep this brief. But I think it's an important question to ask, even though I assume we're all tired. I'm actually fairly socially liberal on the trans issues. I give an example. I'm a social dancer, a dance ballroom, a little bit of East Coast swing and blues, and I've had at least probably a couple of trans partners at various points. One who was reasonably regular with blues dancing. And I will always ask her, using the right quote-unquote right programs, to dance. And that's just, I think it's just a gentlemanly thing. Do I consider that person to be female? No, and I believe I've told that person as well in our series of conversations. No, I don't consider you to be female in that sense, but I'm a gentleman, and that's how we do this. That being said, it seems to be a question of female spaces. Clearly, for a lot of men, I can't speak for men as a class, but I can say that for many men, they would not probably be concerned about having trans men in the men's washrooms. I don't think that's a really high priority for most men. I don't think most men probably care. Even when women show up, if the ladies' line is a bit too long, I think you'll find that most of us are, so long as you don't try to change the male social norms or whatever in the washroom space, most of us will be pretty accommodating for the most part if you happen to wander in. Even if you appear fully female or what have you. But that being said, I guess the question is, so there seems to be a question of safety. One of the big issues that I work on here at UBC is sexual assault policies, theories of sexual assault, statistics of sexual assault. And so the question, because you brought up safety a number of times, is one to which I genuinely do not have the answer, and I'm curious, is do you know whether there's actually any research on this policy question from professional sex researchers? I wouldn't be surprised because it's probably a very hot kind of issue for them to wade into, and I was very disappointed on some other sexual assault areas that they weren't involved, some of the people I've been in contact with, the network I've been in contact with. But the question is there any research on the degree to which this actually does present a danger to these communities? I grant that hypothetically it seems plausible, but is there any research, including in places that currently do have these women's spaces open to people with trans identities, is there any research that you're aware of, or any sort of official opinion pieces from professional sex researchers? Obviously, the earlier one would be preferable, to get some idea of what risk this genuinely presents. Thank you.
I mean, there have been assaults when men have identified as transgender and then been allowed access to women's spaces in prisons, for example, in shelters, things like that. So the question of sex researchers, I mean, I don't differentiate between males and males who identify as trans women. So I'm sure there's lots of research that shows that men assault women in spaces, and that men are a danger to women, and that there's certain spaces where women are particularly vulnerable, like in change rooms where women and girls are naked, and in transition houses and in prisons and things like that. So I don't know.
Keep the response brief. I understand what you're saying. I'm actually deeply sympathetic, especially in cases of pre-op trans folks or people who don't want to transition. Certainly within a change room context, I'm deeply sympathetic to women who would be uncomfortable with that situation. I really wonder, it's so incredible, obviously the reason why we're meeting is it's an incredibly complicated policy area, and I wonder whether socially or policy we can eventually come up with some kind of maybe a gradation system where in certain spaces certain things are expected. For example, if trans women are within a changing space, that perhaps it is an absolute requirement that they be post-op. I know that's going to probably raise a whole lot of other complicated philosophical policy issues, whereas I wonder whether there are perhaps some other women's spaces where it might not present such an issue for trans women to be in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, lesbianism and lesbians don't exist if a man can say he's a woman and also be a lesbian. Like, I think you're right. I think that it's just that society still doesn't really care that much about lesbians. And
We're
so
not
I think,
labeled TERFs.
yeah, I mean, I think you're not even supposed to identify as lesbian anymore. You're supposed to identify as queer. Yeah, it's really appalling, and it's true that it's like trans-identified males have taken over the dyke marches. And like you said, are bullying lesbians who are saying, no, lesbians are female. It's psycho.
Okay.
I don't know what else to say. You're right.
I just want to say that your concern around witness protection programs and naming is like valid if like that is their circumstance. But I haven't heard of it here. Like our concern is unfortunately because like violence can come to somebody when there are like really like conservative religious stigma, especially in South America. I'm sure you can't imagine those circumstances. But part of our concern is also conflating biology and gender as well. It's like I've heard trans women sometimes demand to be acknowledged as biologically female, and that kind of leads to our concern as well around, like you mentioned, looking for some examples around statistics. If you watch Megan's testimony against Bill C-16 with Paul Dirks and Hilla Kerner, they do a really great, Paul Dirks especially from Women Mean Something, list a few examples of what happens when you relax rules around gender segregation for women's safety, and how predators unfortunately take advantage, not necessarily more than a male would, not necessarily more so because they're transgender, but just that's unfortunately what happens. People like Madeline Hawks and Shauna Smith and Karen White, those are their trans names, but yeah, that does happen, so thank you.
I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something new. I hope you guys didn't all agree. I mean, I wouldn't want this to be a circle jerk, for sure. It was really pleasant. I had a lot of fun learning a lot about this. This was all alien to me. But I'm glad. I'm glad that we're able to hold events like this. I'm really glad that there wasn't a brigade of protesters entered. That was really fun. I'm really pleasantly surprised. So please, feel free, come after the show. We'll be here for some time if you want to ask more about the group, and maybe ask Megan, will you be around for maybe a couple minutes?
Yes.
Awesome.
I'm gonna get drinks, so I don't know.
Yeah, let's all get drinks and pizza. If you want to follow us, totally.
Come and ask me questions there.
Yeah, awesome. Just down the way over at Mercantis.
No one can find their way around campus.
Just follow us.
Everyone got lost trying to find the building.